There is a rule on the rig that nobody writes down, nobody includes in the orientation packet, nobody mentions during the safety briefing on your first day when they hand you your hard hat and your fire-resistant coveralls and your steel-toed boots and walk you through the muster stations and a lifeboat drill. The rule is this: when the wind through the derrick starts to sound like a voice, you stop what you're doing, you put down your tools, and you go inside. You do not investigate. You do not look up into the derrick structure to find the source. You do not stand at the railing and stare out at the Gulf and try to determine whether what you are hearing is wind moving through steel or something else entirely. You go inside, you pour yourself a cup of coffee, you sit under fluorescent light, and you wait for the sound to stop. Every veteran on the platform knows this rule. None of them can tell you where it came from. It is simply one of those understandings that accumulates over time in a place where men spend months in close proximity to something very large and very indifferent, which is the ocean, and something very isolated and very precarious, which is a steel platform sitting on top of it. And the combination of those two things produces, in men who pay attention, a particular kind of knowledge that cannot be formalized, but is nonetheless exactly as reliable as any rule in any safety manual ever. Written, I'm a roustabout. Night shift. The Herren Star platform, approximately 90 miles off the Louisiana coast in the Gulf of Mexico. If you do not know what a roustabout is, the short version is that I am the person who does the work that every other classification of rig worker does not want to do. I clean, I paint, I do general maintenance, I move equipment and supplies. I scrub the metal deck at 3 in the morning while the Gulf of Mexico tries to take the platform apart around me, and the derrick, that enormous lattice steel tower at the center of the platform that guides the drill string into the earth, makes sounds in the wind that have no business coming from steel. The deck is always greasy. It is greasy with seawater and petroleum and the residue of industrial processes that never completely stop, not even in the middle of the night, not even in the worst weather. You scrub it anyway. You scrub it because a slippery deck is a deadly deck, and because the work of maintaining the physical integrity of the platform is never finished, and because the alternative to working is standing still on a platform 90 miles from shore in the Gulf of Mexico at 3 in the morning, and standing still gives you too much time to listen. I have been on the Herren Star for 11 months. Before that, I worked a platform in the North Sea for 2 years. And before that, I spent 4 years doing general labor on supply boats that service platforms throughout the Gulf. So I understand the offshore world with the depth of someone who has grown up in it, who knows its rhythms and its dangers and its particular brand of isolation that is different from every other kind of isolation because it is surrounded by something constantly moving, constantly hostile, constantly reminding you of how small the platform is relative to the amount of ocean it is sitting in. I'm not a person who frightens easily. I say this not as a boast, but as context, because everything that follows requires you to understand that what I experienced on the Herren Star was not the product of an overactive imagination or first-timer nerves or the psychological strain of isolation. Because I have been isolated before, and I know what isolation does to a person, and what happened to me on the Herren Star was something else entirely. The platform runs on 2 crews, the day crew and the night crew, 12 hours each, rotating on a 28-day schedule. You're on the platform for 28 days, and then you're on shore for 28 days, and the on-platform portion of your life has its own interior logic, its own compressed social world, its own time signature that is nothing like shore time. On the platform, time is organized by shift change and meal times and the sound of machinery and the state of the weather, and the night shift has a texture that is completely different from the day shift. Not merely because it is dark, but because at night the platform's relationship to the ocean changes. During the day, the Gulf is visible, knowable, a body of water with a horizon and a color and a surface you can read. At night, it is a sound. It is a smell. It is the physical sensation of the platform moving very slightly, continuously, on its anchored legs as the waves push through. A movement so subtle that you stop consciously registering it after a few days, but that your body never stops registering, and that your body communicates to you in the form of an ambient unease that is with you every moment of every night's shift, like a very quiet alarm that never quite reaches the threshold of alarm, but never goes below it either. My first indication that something was wrong with the season, with this particular rotation, with some aspect of the situation that I could not yet name, was in the second week of the rotation. I was on deck at approximately 2:15 in the morning, doing a routine washdown of the pipe rack area, when a platform hand I was working with, a man named Cody who had been on the Herren for 6 years, and who was the most unflappable human being I have ever personally encountered. A man who had worked through 2 Category 1 hurricanes, and a derrick fire and a blowout scare, and whose default emotional register was mild amusement, stopped working and looked up at the derrick and stayed looking for what I estimated to be about 30 seconds without moving or speaking. I asked him what he was looking at. He looked at me. He looked back at the derrick. He said nothing. He picked up his tool and went back to work. I looked at the derrick. It was fully lit, the rig lighting illuminating the lattice steel structure from multiple angles, and there was nothing there that I could identify as wrong. But the way Cody had looked at it, the 30-second duration, the stillness, the specific quality of his attention, which was not curiosity, but something that I would have to call recognition, that stayed with me. The wind through a derrick is a phenomenon with a range. At low wind speeds, it produces a low hum, almost subsonic, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. As wind increases, it moves up through various registers, a whistle, a moan, a complex layered sound with multiple frequencies running simultaneously. At high wind speeds, it becomes genuinely loud, genuinely unpleasant, a shriek that penetrates hearing protection and gets into the bone of the skull. I have stood under derricks in conditions ranging from dead calm to sustained 40-knot winds, and I have heard the full range of what steel and wind produces. What I heard on the Herren starting the 3rd week of that rotation, was not in that range. It was in the register of the moan, technically speaking in the frequency band that the wind does produce under certain conditions, but it had an interior structure that wind does not produce, a modulation, a cadence, a sense of phrase and pause that was not the irregular chaos of turbulence, but something organized. I did not want to say the word singing, because singing implies music, and what I heard was not music. It was more like speech heard through a wall, through water, the rhythm and cadence of language stripped of its semantic content, leaving only the shape of communication. I heard it for the first time on a Tuesday night in the 3rd week, standing on the south end of the main deck, running a pressure wash over the grating. The wind was steady at approximately 22 knots from the southeast, a consistent breeze, not unusual, not severe. The sound from the derrick at that wind speed should have been a steady mid-register whistle with some harmonic variation. What I heard was something that rose and fell in a pattern I could almost predict, almost anticipate the next phrase of, the way you can almost predict the next phrase of song in a language you have heard but never learned. I turned off the pressure washer. The sound continued. I stood on the deck with the pressure washer gun in my hand, and I listened for 45 seconds, and I counted 6 distinct phrases of that sound before the wind shifted 2 degrees and the character of it changed abruptly back to ordinary wind and steel, and I stood there for another minute after that, in the ordinary wind sound, replaying the 45 seconds in my head and understanding that I was going to have difficulty explaining what I had just heard in terms that did not make me sound like someone who had been at sea too long. I told the rule to the new hand who joined us at the start of week 4. His name was Fletcher, 23 years old, first Gulf rotation after 2 years on inland work, and he had the specific combination of eagerness and ignorance that is endearing in someone new to the offshore world, because you know it will not last, and you respect the innocence of it while it exists. I told him to rule the way you tell new people unwritten rules, as a piece of practical wisdom without elaboration. When the wind through the derrick sounds like a voice, go inside. Fletcher looked at me with the expression that young men make when they're trying to decide whether an older colleague is serious or hazing them. I held his gaze and said nothing additional, and he decided I was serious. He said, "Has that actually happened to you?" I said yes. He said, "What does it sound like?" I said, "It sounds like something talking that has never had a mouth." Fletcher did not ask follow-up questions. He was a smart kid. He understood that some questions improve nobody's situation. Week 4, night 9. The weather had been building for 2 days, a slow pressure system tracking northeast from the Yucatan. Not a named storm, not anything that triggered evacuation protocols, but a sustained deterioration of conditions that had the deck wet and the seas running at 10 to 12 feet and the wind at the derrick doing exactly what I had told Fletcher it sometimes does. I was on the drill floor doing an inspection of the BOP controls when Fletcher's voice came over the radio saying he needed eyes on the main deck, south end, because he was hearing something that he thought was a structural issue with the south railing. I acknowledged and I walked to the south deck. Fletcher was standing at the south railing. He was looking out at the Gulf. He had his hands on the railing, and he was leaning forward slightly, the way a person leans when they're trying to hear something more clearly. The wind was running at 31 knots per the weather station readout. I had checked 20 minutes earlier, and the derrick was producing exactly the sound I had described, the sound of communication in a language that has no language, and Fletcher was listening to it with an expression on his face that I recognized immediately and that frightened me more than the sound itself. It was the expression of someone who understands, not someone hearing noise, someone hearing content. I crossed the deck and grabbed his arm. He did not react immediately. I grabbed harder. He turned and looked at me with the eyes of a person who has been somewhere else for a moment, who is coming back from a distance. I said his name. He blinked. He said, "Do you hear that?" I said yes. He said, "Do you hear what it's saying?" I said no, and I pulled him away from the railing toward the interior hatch, and I held that hatch open until he was through it, and I followed him in, and I closed the hatch behind us, and the wind sound dropped to a muffle, and the quality of the air inside was so different from the outside air, still and warm, and smelling of coffee and diesel and habitation, that the contrast was physical, like surfacing from a dive. I got Fletcher into the galley and put a mug of coffee in his hands and sat across from him and said, "What did you think it was saying?" He held the mug with both hands and looked at it for a long time. Then he said it was saying my name. He said it the way a person states a fact they have already fully processed, without drama or distress, with the calm of something accepted. I said, "It has no idea who you are." He looked up at me. He said, "Are you sure?" And the thing is, I was not sure, and my not being sure was evident in the way I could not immediately answer, and Fletcher saw that, and the expression that crossed his face in that moment, the understanding that even a man with 11 months on this platform was not sure, was the most frightening thing I saw in my entire time on the Herren Star. The wind dropped before the next shift. Conditions normalized. Fletcher was fine. He finished the rotation, took his 28 days off, and came back for the next rotation. He never brought up that night again, and I never raised it either, because on the offshore world, there is a covenant of productive silence about the things the ocean does that cannot be processed in ordinary language. He did, however, do one thing differently in every subsequent rotation I worked with him. Whenever he went to the south deck at night, he kept his ears covered. Not with hearing protection exactly. With his hands. He would work with one hand and keep the other cupped over the ear facing the derrick. He never explained this to anyone. He never had to. The men who had been on the platform long enough looked at him doing it and nodded and said nothing, which is the offshore world version of full understanding. I'm still on the rotation. I'm still a roustabout. I am writing this in my bunk during my current 28 days on a night when the weather is calm and the derrick is quiet, and the gulf outside my porthole is a flat black surface reflecting a quarter moon. On nights like this, it is easy to believe that the platform is just a machine, just steel and pipe and electricity and labor, just a thing that humans built in the ocean to extract what the ocean sits on top of. On nights like this, the rule sounds like superstition. And then the weather changes and the wind picks up and the derrick begins its range of sounds. And you find yourself listening with more attention than you intended, trying to determine which register the sound is in, which frequency band, whether the cadence is random or organized, and you remember that there's a great deal of ocean under this platform. Miles of it. Miles of dark water and darker rock, and whatever lives and moves in those depths that has never once in its entire existence been required to acknowledge that the surface exists, let alone the things the surface has built. And you go inside, and you pour coffee, and you sit under the lights, and you wait. Story number 2. At 3:27 in the morning, the Indian Ocean produces a particular quality of darkness that I have experienced in no other body of water in my 17 years of maritime security work. A darkness that is not merely the absence of light, but is a presence in itself, a weight, a dimensionality that the thermal optics in my hands render in shades of gray that should be informative, but are instead simply different kinds of darkness. I am scanning the eastern horizon. The freighter beneath my feet is 184 meters of steel carrying automotive parts from Chennai to Mombasa, making 14 knots through a sea that is currently Beaufort 3, light chop, good visibility by day, complete sensory isolation by night. My name is not something I am going to use in this account. What I'm going to use is the specific sequence of events that occurred on the 43rd day of a 45-day contract. Events that I have reviewed in my mind approximately every night since for the past 8 months. Each review producing the same conclusion, which is that I do not have one. Anti-piracy security on Indian Ocean commercial shipping is, contrary to what you might assume from the word piracy, primarily a job of sustained vigilance in the absence of anything happening. The threat is real. The area running from the Gulf of Aden down through the Somali Basin and into the broader Western Indian Ocean has seen enough actual incidents over the past 2 decades that every shipping company operating the route carries armed security. The threat assessment is current, and the protocols are serious. But the actuality of the job, the lived experience of it, is hours and hours and hours of watching dark water through optics and seeing nothing, punctuated by the occasional actual contact. A small boat, a fishing dhow, something that needs to be identified and logged and assessed, and almost always determined to be exactly what it appears to be. The actual engagements, the genuine piracy attempts that reach the stage of physical confrontation, are relatively rare. What is not rare is the watching. The watching is constant. The watching is the job. I have 4 team members on this contract. 2 of them are below at any given time during night watch, rotating every 4 hours. I am on the bridge wing at 3:27 in the morning with a thermal imaging monocular and a radio, and a man named Don at the opposite bridge wing running his own optics on the western aspect. The Indian Ocean at this time of year, and in this sea state, is not empty. There's traffic. There are other freighters on similar routes, dhows running local fishing grounds, occasional naval vessels running anti-piracy patrols of their own. The skill in thermal scanning is not finding objects in the water, it is correctly identifying them. A heat signature on thermal is a bright spot in gray nothing. And the work of the job is determining whether the bright spot is a diesel engine in a small wooden boat with 6 men and a ladder, or is a diesel engine in a small wooden boat with 6 men and a ladder and nothing else. A fishing family working their grounds at night, which is entirely normal and entirely legal and not your concern. The protocol for a contact is identify, log the bearing and estimated range, classify if possible from thermal signature, alert the bridge, continue monitoring. The protocol for an unclassified contact, something you can see but cannot determine the nature of, is maintain observation, close the range estimate if the vessel appears to be on an intercept course, notify the master, go to elevated readiness. The protocol for a vessel that is approaching without AIS, without running lights, in a location and manner consistent with a piracy approach is alert the team, wake the standby, notify the master, prepare defensive positions, attempt radio contact on channel 16 with searchlight as a deterrent, and be prepared for whatever comes next. I have gone through that protocol 11 times in 17 years. Twice it went all the way to the last step. I am still here, so you know how those ended. What there is no protocol for is what I see at 3:27 that night. And the absence of protocol is what I keep returning to, because protocols exist for everything. The entire industry runs on protocols, and the gap where protocol should be and isn't is the shape of something that has not been anticipated. And things that have not been anticipated in maritime security are by definition dangerous. I am running a slow sweep from south to north along the eastern horizon at approximately 3 miles range on the thermal when I pick up the contact. It is not at the horizon. It is closer than the horizon, approximately 1,500 meters off the starboard beam, and the reason I nearly sweep past it without registering it is that it is small. Not Dow small, smaller than that. A thermal return that registers as approximately the size of a single adult human body in the water on the surface 1,500 meters from the starboard side of a freighter doing 14 knots through the western Indian Ocean at 3:27 in the morning. I stop the sweep. I hold the monocular on the contact. I adjust the focus. The return is clear. It is a thermal mass in the water, the size and shape of a person. My first thought is man overboard from a vessel ahead of us. That happens. People go overboard. Fishing crews, deckhands, passengers on larger vessels. The protocol for a man overboard contact is alert the bridge immediately, which I do, radioing the bridge and reporting a possible man overboard contact at bearing 095, range 1,500 meters. The officer of the watch comes back and asks me to confirm. I confirm. He begins the man overboard alert sequence, which involves slowing and turning and lighting up the search beams and waking the master and preparing rescue operations. I hold the thermal on the contact. The contact does not move. This is the first thing that is wrong. A person in the water with a vessel approaching and searchlights coming on moves. They wave. They turn toward the light. They do something that living people in the water do when they see a ship. The contact does not move. The master is on the bridge. The search beams are running. The ship has slowed to 5 knots and begun a turn to bring the starboard side toward the contact. The searchlights are covering the water at 1,500 meters, and then 1,200, and then 1,000 as we close, and I'm holding the thermal on the contact, and the contact is not moving and is not responding to the lights, and Don has come off the port bridge wing to look over my shoulder, and he is very quiet in the way that Don gets quiet when something is not right. At 700 meters, the searchlights should be illuminating the contact directly. I look over the top of the thermal monocular with my bare eyes at the illuminated water, and I see nothing. Lit water. No person. No debris. No reiki. Nothing. I put the monocular back to my eye. The thermal contact is there. 700 meters, slightly ahead of the beam now as we have turned. Thermal return, human-sized, clear. In my bare eye, nothing. I tell Don. He takes the thermal and looks. He holds it for a long time. He gives it back. His expression, which normally conveys nothing more emotionally specific than professional assessment, has something in it that I have not seen there before, a consideration, a careful choosing of what to think. He says, could be a surface temperature anomaly. I say, shaped like that? He is quiet. I know what he is thinking because I am thinking it too, which is that thermal anomalies in the ocean are real and documented and can produce false contacts, but they're diffuse, they're irregular, they do not produce contacts with the discrete outline of a standing human being, and they do not maintain their shape as a vessel closes and the angle of view changes, which this one is doing. It is maintaining its shape. It is tracking correctly for a fixed surface object as we move toward it. It has no drift that would indicate a floating debris mass being moved by the current. It is in the water. It is the size of a person. It is visible on thermal and invisible to the eye. And it is not moving. We get to 400 meters. The searchlights are bright enough at this range to illuminate the specific wavelength banding of a thermal target, meaning if there is a physical object there, we will see it. There is nothing. The master is on the bridge wing beside me at this point, and he takes the thermal monocular from me and looks, and he is a man with 31 years at sea, and he has done this passage more times than I have had hot meals on this vessel. And he looks at the thermal return, and he looks at the illuminated water, and he says nothing for a full minute. Then he says, bearing? I give him the bearing. He looks at the illuminated water on that bearing. Then he says, quietly, to me, not into the radio, have you seen this before? I say no. He says I have. Once. In this ocean. Different ship, different passage. Same thing. I ask him what it is. He looks at the thermal return for another moment. Then he lowers the monocular and says, I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, it knows we're looking at it. I take the monocular back. I keep the thermal on the contact. The master goes back to the bridge. The ship maintains position, drifting slowly in the chop, and the searchlights hold on the empty water where the thermal contact is clearly and unmistakably present. And I watch it for 11 more minutes before it disappears. Not fades, not drifts. Disappears in a single update cycle of the thermal sensor gone. I hold the optic on the water for another 20 minutes. Nothing. The master resumes course. We log the incident as a false thermal contact, possible surface temperature anomaly, no vessel recovered, no person in water, search negative. That is the official record. That is what the log says. What the log does not say is what the master said to me when I came off watch, and he was pouring himself coffee in the officer's mess. And I came in and sat down without being invited and looked at him and asked him, what did it know we were doing? He looked at his coffee. He said, looking. I said, it knew we were looking at it. He said, yes. I said, what does that mean? He said, I think it means there are things in this ocean that are aware of us the way we are aware of them, that have been out here longer than shipping lanes have existed. He took a long drink of coffee. He said, I think it means we are not the only things watching. I have done 4 contracts since that passage. I have not seen the thermal contact again. I have, however, changed one thing about how I run my watch. I now do my sweeps in both directions, east to west and west to east, and at the end of each sweep before I begin the return sweep, I pause and I look at the water directly below the ship, straight down into the dark water right alongside the hull, with the thermal on full sensitivity. I do not know what I am looking for. I do not have a protocol for what I would do if I found it. But the master's word from that night are with me every watch. There are things in this ocean that are aware. And if something is aware enough to know when it is being watched from 1,500 meters by a man on a bridge wing with thermal optics, it is aware enough to be interested in the watching back. The last night of my most recent contract 4 days ago, I was doing my end of sweep pause, looking straight down at the water alongside the hull. The sea was flat calm, Beaufort 1, almost no surface disturbance, and the water was very dark. I held the thermal on the water alongside the hull. The thermal showed nothing. I lowered the monocular and looked with bare eyes at the black water 4 meters below the bridge wing, and in the faint ambient light of the ship's own illumination I saw, for a period that I am placing conservatively at 3 seconds, a reflection in the water that should not have been there. Not a reflection of the ship, not a reflection of the sky, a reflection of something looking up. The angle, the orientation of the reflected shapes was unambiguous. The reflection was looking up, at the bridge wing, at me. I held my eyes on it for 3 seconds, and then it was gone, replaced by the ordinary black water and its ordinary reflection of ship light. And I stood at the bridge wing for a long time after, very still, understanding finally what the master meant on that passage 8 months ago. We're not the only things watching. And I think, though I have no evidence for this beyond the specific quality of those 3 seconds, that we have never been. Story number 3. The footsteps behind me have been there for 11 minutes, and I have not looked back because I was trained in this job by a man named Garza who worked port security for 22 years and who told me on my first week of training that there are 2 kinds of things that follow you on a container yard at 4 in the morning. Things that want you to look back and things that want you to keep walking. And the difficulty is that you cannot tell which kind you have until you choose, and the choice cannot be reversed. I have not looked back. I'm not sure I am making the right decision. I am writing this now, months later, because what happened in the 26th minute of those footsteps was something that I need to put into words in order to determine whether the words make it more or less real. And so far they're making it more real, and I am not sure what to do with that. Tampa, Florida, Port of Tampa. The container yard on the northwest side of the terminal, away from the active berths, the storage area where containers wait in their stacked rows for chassis and trucks to come and collect them and carry them out into the normal world. I have worked port security at this facility for 4 years, the last 2 on the night rotation, the 4 a.m. to noon shift, which means I'm always on the yard during the hours that the fog comes in off the bay. Tampa Bay fog is a specific phenomenon, not the thick, blinding fog of a horror movie. Not exactly, but a low settled mist that has enough density to reduce visibility in the container rows from the end of the row to about 60 feet of visible space, and then a gray wall, and behind the gray wall sounds. Sounds carry strangely in port fog. Cranes that are 400 meters away sound like they are 15 meters away. Trucks on the outer road sound like they are in the row next to you. The metal contraction, sounds of containers cooling from the heat of the previous day, sound like someone tapping from inside them. If you work the yard at night long enough, you learn to read the fog's acoustics the way you learn to read any environment. You develop a calibration. You know what normal sounds like in the fog, and you know when something is off. My route on a standard night watch is a 2-mile walking loop through the storage area, taking me down 6 of the main container rows and across the connector lanes between them, with specific inspection points at the gate access panels and the lighting towers in the one area we call the dead zone, which is the far northwestern corner of the yard, where containers have been sitting long enough that we have had to open and inspect them for water infiltration, and where the fog is consistently the thickest because of the way the grade of the yard channels the bay missed into that corner. The dead zone is not a comfortable place at 4 in the morning. It is not a comfortable place at noon, actually, but at night it is the kind of uncomfortable that lives in the body rather than the mind, a physical unease that has nothing to do with specific threat assessment and everything to do with the accumulated specific quality of the location, which is a space where many large metal containers full of goods from distant places sit in fog and wait indefinitely for purposes that are not your concern, and the combined effect of the metal and the mist and the waiting in the dark is something that you learn to move through efficiently and not to linger in. My first week on the night rotation, I asked Garza about the dead zone, and he told me what he told everyone, which is that the sensation of being washed in the dead zone is a well-documented artifact of the acoustic environment, that the tight rows and the fog reflections create an auditory illusion of presence, that every new night officer goes through the same experience of feeling followed in the dead zone, and every experienced officer eventually stops feeling it. He said this in the way that people say things that are true as far as they go, which is not always as far as you need to go. The second half of what Garza told me came in a different conversation. 6 weeks later, when I asked him directly whether he had ever had an experience on the yard that he could not explain. He put down his coffee and looked at the far wall and said that he did not like to describe specific incidents because describing specific incidents made them more vivid than he needed them to be. But he said this: the dead zone is not the same at all hours. At some hours, it is simply a place where containers sit in fog. At other hours, it has a quality that he described, after some consideration, as occupied. I asked him occupied by what? He said he did not know. He said the closest he could come to a description was the feeling of standing in a room where a conversation has just stopped because you walked in. That specific, sudden, aware silence of a space that was not empty a moment before. I asked him when those hours were. He said 4 to 5 a.m., most consistently during the months when the bay fog is thickest, which is September through December. I was hired in October. My first 4 months on night shift were September through December. Garza knew this when he told me. I have never been sure whether that was a kindness or the opposite. The night the footsteps follow me, I am in the 3rd week of November. The fog is exactly what Garza described it being at its worst. A settled low layer that cuts the tops of the container stacks off at approximately 20 feet and reduces row visibility to 50 or 60 feet of gray tunnel. I am in the 4th row from the west, the one we call D row, which runs north-south for approximately 300 meters, and I am moving south at my standard inspection pace when the footsteps begin. They are behind me. The sound is the specific sound of boots on pavement, not gravel, not metal, pavement at a pace that matches mine in cadence, and I stop to listen and they stop when I stop, which rules out the acoustic echo effect that Garza mentioned, because acoustic echoes in the fog do not stop when you stop. They continue for a fraction of a second after, their delay revealing them as reflections. These stop simultaneously, which means they are not a reflection. I do not look back. I remember Garza's words. I resume walking. The footsteps resume. I am about 40 meters from the southern end of D row and the connector lane that will take me east toward E row and back toward the main yard office and the lit areas of the terminal. 40 meters is a distance I have walked hundreds of times. 40 meters tonight takes me longer than it should because the footsteps behind me do something in the middle of that 40 meters that I did not expect, something that Garza's framework of things that want you to look back and things that want you to keep walking did not account for, which is that they move. Not faster, not slower. They move. They go from behind me to my right between me and the container row wall, appearing on my right flank without the sound of movement crossing from behind me to the side. They simply arrive on my right in the gap between D row and E row, which is a connector lane of approximately 8 feet wide. And they're in that connector lane, pace matched to mine, keeping perfect lateral position. And I cannot see into the lane because the fog in the connector lanes is always thicker than in the main rows in my torch, which is a 200 lumen handheld reaches approximately 40 feet in clear air and perhaps 8 feet in the connector lane fog. 8 feet of illuminated mist, and the footsteps 6 feet into it. I stop. They stop. I point my torch into the connector lane. 8 feet of illuminated gray mist. I call out, "Port security, identify yourself." My voice goes into the fog and does not come back as an echo, which is wrong. The fog always returns voice as a faint echo in the container rows. Always. And the absence of echo is wrong in the same way that the absence of a heartbeat sound from something that should have a heartbeat is wrong. Nothing responds. I wait 5 seconds. I pull my radio and call the main gate. The gate operator answers, and I ask him if there are any personnel in the northwest yard, and he checks his log and says no. Last personnel entry to the northwest yard was a driver who exited at 2:15. No entries since. I say copy. I pull my radio away. I point my torch into the connector lane. I count to 3. I step into the connector lane. 8 feet of illuminated mist, as I said. At 8 feet, the mist closes completely, and my torch penetrates no further. I walk to the 8-foot mark. I listen. I hear the cranes from the active berths, far away and close sounding at once. I hear a truck on the outer road. I hear the metal contraction of a container somewhere in E row. I hear my own breathing, which is measured, which I am keeping measured deliberately, and which is the loudest human sound on this yard right now, because the footsteps have stopped. I walk the connector lane from D row to E row. The lane is 30 feet wide. I walk all 30 feet. I find no one. I find no evidence of anyone. No scuff marks in the light coating of bay dust on the pavement that I look for specifically, angling my torch low across the surface the way you are supposed to when you want to see disturbance in a settled layer. The pavement in the connector lane is undisturbed. I clear E row. I finish my loop. I write my log entry noting no personnel found in northwest yard, no incidents. I do not note the footsteps because I cannot note footsteps without a source. In port security, an observation without a source is not an observation. It is a perception, and perceptions are not log because the log is a legal document, and a legal document cannot contain perceptions, only facts. The fact is that I heard sounds consistent with a person following my patrol route for 26 minutes. Including a lateral transition that physical mechanics cannot account for, and found no person and found no evidence that a person had been there. Those are the facts. The perception that sits underneath the facts is something I am choosing to leave out of this record except to say this. At the moment I stepped into the connector lane and the footsteps stopped, there was a period of approximately 2 seconds before the cranes and the truck and the container sounds came back into my hearing, a period of complete silence across the entire yard, and in that silence, from approximately 2 feet to my right, at the height of a person's mouth, I heard the sound of breathing. One breath in, one breath out, slow and deliberate. The kind of breath a person takes when they are waiting. The kind a person takes when they know you cannot see them, but they know exactly where you are, and they are content with this arrangement, and they have no intention of changing it. Not tonight. Not when you're the one with the torch and the radio and the log that requires facts, and they're the one that leaves no evidence. One breath in, one breath out, and then the cranes and the trucks and the containers and the rest of the world came back into the silence like water filling a space, and I walked out of that connector lane and completed my patrol. And I have completed that same patrol every night since, and I have not heard the footsteps again. I have heard other things, but I have not heard the footsteps. And I keep thinking about what Garza said about the 2 kinds of things that follow you. Things that want you to look back, and things that want you to keep walking. I kept walking. I never looked back, and I still do not know, on any given night when the fog comes in off the bay, and settles low, and the container rows, and my torch reaches only 60 feet into the gray nothing ahead of me. Whether that was the right choice, or whether the thing that breathed 2 feet from my ear in a fog-blind connector lane at 4 in the morning is still there, still patient, still content with an arrangement that it has no reason to change because it has already gotten exactly what it wanted, which is for me. To know that it is there and to not know anything else at all.